Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I have always had the sense that I preferred to spend my time in ways that were not considered socially acceptable. So, you know, I preferred when I was a kid, I liked to go off and do creative projects by myself, and I liked to play with my friends kind of one-on-one. And I was really lucky that I grew up in a family where these things were considered totally normal and great. But I saw that whenever I would go out to school and to camp, that wasn't the way of the world. I went to this camp when I was 9 years old, and on the first day of camp, you know, all I really wanted to do was read, but what we were made to do instead was gather together and do this cheer that we were told was going to be the cheer we would be reciting for the rest of the summer to instill camp spirit. So the cheer went like this. It went, R-O-W-D-I-E, that's the way we spell rowdy, 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 let's get rowdy. I mean, really, that's what we had to do, like every day, day after day at camp. And I think that that is the world that we all live in, even if we're not explicitly doing these cheers nowadays in our workplaces and in our schools. That is the underlying message.
And how did you even notice for the first time that it wasn't just you? I swear I've gone through my life with these various personality traits that I just assumed were like weird little quirks, like feeling a desperate urge to leave a party after an hour, feeling an urge to just be alone in a quiet little place. All these things, and you seem to have spotted that actually this is loads of us. How did you even come across this?
Yeah, you know, that happened, I think, when I was a lawyer. I mean, I became a Wall Street lawyer, of all things, which is a funny career choice, I guess, for someone with this collection of personality traits. And at first I went into my legal career thinking that I was going to be at this big disadvantage because I didn't have the qualities that I associated with being a lawyer. And then I started looking around and realizing that there were a lot of people in my law firm who had the kinds of traits that I did. And that they were using them to good effect, and that I was starting to use them to good effect, and I was trying to understand what this thing was. And at first, the only language that I had for it was gender. So I thought it must be that I'm a woman, and women have these traits of, you know, being able to listen well, and, you know, preparing really thoroughly for meetings, and building good one-on-one alliances behind the scenes, and things like this. But then I started to notice that it was men too. Some men had these traits, and some women did not at all. And that's when I realized it was actually introversion and extroversion, and that there was no real language for talking about questions of identity in the workplace and in society in general. You know, like gender was the only one we had.
There's certain aspects of our society which are built around the extrovert ideal. Open plan offices, and even more worryingly than that, schools where kids no longer sit in rows, but they sit in pods. They have to face each other. And it's all about groupthink. And you very powerfully make a case against groupthink in the book.
I'm talking about something different from the original conception of groupthink from decades ago. I'm talking about this value system that we live with now, all of us, this idea that all creativity emerges from this strangely gregarious place. And that what follows from that is what John is saying. We set up our schools and we set up our workplaces for maximum group interaction all the time, thinking that this will enable us to be creative. And this is a real misconception, because solitude is such a crucial ingredient of creativity, and we're losing sight of solitude. If you take a group of people and put them into a meeting and have them talk about something, the opinions of the loudest person or the most charismatic person or the most assertive person, those are the ones that the group tends to follow. And yet, researchers have looked at this. There's no correlation between being that best talker and having the best ideas. So if you're a manager or an employer, and your job is to get the best of people's brains and, you know, really cultivate the talents of the people working for you, it's like the worst thing that you can do is throw them into a group situation and just wait for the ideas to rise to the surface, because you're getting such a small percentage of your workforce's thoughts. You know, as we shifted from an agricultural economy to a corporate one, we started to admire people who could be magnetic and charismatic, because these were the qualities that seemed to matter for job interviews and things like that. And so in the earlier agricultural economy, our self-help books used to have titles like Character, the grandest thing in the world. And they would feature as their role models people like a timid shop girl who had no money at all, and she went out one snowy evening, and she came across a beggar who looked like he really needed help, and so she gave him all of her money before anyone, and then she ran away before anybody could see what she had done. And it was like this act of anonymous charity was seen as the thing to aspire to. But then the self-help books later on became the ones that we kind of know of today, like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And those were all about teaching us to be more entertaining, more dynamic, and that kind of thing.
In the midst of introverts and extroverts are this other group, which don't really get that much of a mention in the book, which are ambiverts, which are people who's pretty much halfway.
Right.
I do feel that the ambiverts don't get too much of a mention in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason that I made that choice is because I really see the book as speaking to the introvert in us all. You know, even for people who would consider themselves not ambiverts, but extroverts too. I think that we're living in a society now that is so overly extroverted. It's so lopsided in that direction that even extroverts don't really feel like they have permission to tap into the more introverted side of themselves. You know, I think for any trait of human nature, any aspect, it has its pros and it has its cons. And what I'm saying is that for too long we've looked at introversion only through its disadvantages, and we've looked at extroversion only through its advantages. So I'm trying to now fill in the gaps, and what that can sometimes sound like is, you know, down with extroverts, up with introverts. If you look at the birth of Apple computer, we tend to associate Apple with Steve Jobs, who was this dazzling showman. But really, the person who invented the Apple computer was a different Steve. It was Steve Wozniak, who's a self-identified introvert. And he created this amazing thing by sitting by himself in a cubicle at Hewlett-Packard, where he was working at the time, late at night and early in the morning before anybody was at work. He would work by himself for months, and then he produced this amazing thing that he then shared with his friend Steve Jobs. And then it was Steve Jobs who said, hey, we should start a company with this. This is amazing. Without Steve Jobs, none of it ever would have come to pass. So it was this combination of letting, you know, the solitary person go off by himself to think in his deep way, and then having a partnership between the two. And in fact, you know, in companies, it's been found that the most effective teams are the ones that are a combination of introvert and extrovert. And the two types are really drawn to each other and really need each other.